sometimes it's crazy how things work out. Like 2018 was assumed to be kind of a rebuilding, retooling on the fly type of year for the Seattle Seahawks. Potentially going to be Pete Carroll's last year. Gone is Cam Chancellor due to injury and retirement. Gone is Richard Sherman. You release him, he leaves via free agency. You lose Earl Thomas early on in the year. He's going to be gone for a good portion of the season due to injury. You just look at some of the pieces, Michael Bennett no longer being there, and so on and so forth. And the Legion of Boom defense was to be no more. You had made the big trade previously a couple of years ago for Jimmy Graham. That didn't really work out that well. He was gone. Like, this looked like it was going to be a rebuilding type of year. And then the Seahawks overachieved, got into the mix, and made the playoffs. It's a hell of a coaching job by Pete Carroll, no question about it. No question about it. So now it's weird, as I was expecting 2019 to be kind of a talk about the rebuilding and retooling of the Seattle Seahawks continuing, is now you're talking about a team that is looking to get back into the playoffs and maybe do some damage once they get there. Which made it interesting to me that they would trade away Frank Clark, who was their best pass rusher last year. I understand you were staring down the barrel of having to pay him a big-time contract. You did manage to get a first-round pick out of that deal. But let's be honest here. Some of the notable picks the Seahawks had in recent years, while all the draft experts and media people talk about, oh, the Seahawks move up and down the draft board so well and they do all these wonderful things. They know how to maneuver up and down the draft board. They don't always draft very well. And in recent years, they have really, really drafted poorly. Malik McDowell ring a bell. Jermaine Ifedi ring a bell to anybody. I mean, it's one thing to get picks. It's another thing to actually turn them into proven commodities and guys that can really play. Which, you look at Frank Clark, a former second-round pick, he's one of those guys that actually did really pan out. So I don't know how much of it in a hurry I would have been to ultimately got rid of him. But they did. So they went out and replaced him in part by signing Ezekiel Ansah in free agency, and then a little bit before the season started, the opportunity came for them to be able to acquire Jadeveon Clowney in 2019 for basically peanuts. You're going to give me Clowney and expect me to only give you Mingo, Martin, and a third-round pick in return, knowing that if Clowney ultimately does leave in free agency, we'll probably get a third or fourth-round pick in 2021 as a compensatory situation. I mean, yeah, I would take that all freaking day long. You had to make that deal. Brilliant by the Seahawks to be able to swoop in and have to give up so little for a guy the talent level of Clowney. Unfortunately for them, Jarran Reed has been suspended for the first 6 games of the 2019 season, which is a real shame. Because for a guy that I really liked coming out of Alabama but didn't expect him to have much to offer in terms of as a pass rusher, he was a double-digit sack guy last year. So your 2 best pass rushers from last year's team, and Frank Clark and Jarran Reed, aren't on the team this year. At least Reed the first 6 games, and Clark is gone entirely. So it makes you a little concerned early on in the season about their pass rush, which made it even more important for them to ultimately acquire Jadeveon Clowney. And then you look at the news that Doug Baldwin's not going to be able to play anymore. Maybe it was a surprise, maybe it wasn't, but that hurts this team. He was one of the better slot weapons in the National Football League, a real go-to target, a safety blanket for Russell Wilson. That's not going to be there anymore, which really hurts that receiving core, which already had some questions about it outside of Doug Baldwin. And when you go to the draft, you look at it, L.J. Collier, was he really worth a late first-round pick? Marquise Blair, they added some talent to that secondary. DK Metcalf at the end of round 2. If you're the Seahawks, he was totally worth the gamble at that point. You could have maybe made the argument that it would have been perfectly okay to draft him at the end of round number 1. Instead, they got him at the end of round number 2. He is so different to a lot of the other guys they have drafted at wide receiver over the years, which leads me to believe that it could potentially work. He could develop into a Josh Gordon type of guy. But what he does he has size and he has speed. And they really, really needed that in that receiving group. I really also liked the selection of Ben Burke-Kirven, the linebacker from Washington in round 5, I believe it was. I think he's a guy that could step up and surprise you at some point that a Pete Carroll would really, really like and might be able to, at some point in time, carve himself out a path as a starter on this team. Looking at this roster going into the season, you got Russell Wilson. You've got a franchise borderline elite quarterback. That's obviously a strength. The running game with Chris Carson and Rashad Penny, while sure you took Penny in the first round last year, again to my point of just because you get a bunch of picks doesn't mean you always know what the hell you're doing with them. They reached on Penny. He couldn't even beat out Chris Carson last year. But as a tandem with Chris Carson, and then you throw in Russell Wilson's abilities with his feet to run with the ball, The Seahawks are going to be able to run the ball in 2019. There's no question about that. Then you look at the linebacking core, primarily based around Bobby Wagner. This is going to be a unit led by arguably the best middle linebacker in the game. That should be very, very good as well. My question marks come around their offensive line still, even though you've added Dwayne Brown and you've added pieces in the past couple of years. How good are they really? Just because you've added new faces in new places doesn't make you a whole lot better. They might be a little bit better, though, and that might be good enough. But I really look at that receiving core, and it really concerns me. Because who do you have? You're going to have a bunch of scrubs and role players. You better hope to God DK Metcalf can break out early. If he does, it changes a lot of things about this team. But if he doesn't, ooh, boy. It could be slim pickings at times for Russell Wilson in the passing game, lacking in options and lacking in guys that could truly get separation down the field. Early on for the Seahawks, I look at week 2 at Pittsburgh, week 3 hosting New Orleans as a couple of key games for this team early on to be able to show what they can do, to be able to show what level of team they are. Then I look later on in the season, another real test could come in. Weeks 12 through 15, they've got 3 or 4 games on the road at Philly. Then they host Minnesota in Seattle. Then they go to Los Angeles to play the Rams. Then they go to Carolina to play the Panthers. That could be another stretch of games that if they're in the mix, that's going to ultimately make or break their season. When I look at this team, though, you've got Pete Carroll, you've got Russell Wilson, you've got a chance. I don't think they're good enough to unseat the Rams in this division, no. But I still think they could be a 9 or 10 win team and find a way to get into one of the 2 wild card slots in the NFC.